Aircraft and Flight: The Complete and Unbiased Brief History. An audiovisual presentation by Hector V. Bello. Material from public domain sources, primarily wikipedia.org. Recorded June 2016. Introduction. The history of aviation has extended over more than 2,000 years, from the earliest forms of aviation, kites, and attempts at tower jumping, to supersonic and hypersonic flight by powered, heavier-than-air jets. Kite flying in China dates back to several hundred years BC and slowly spread around the world. It is thought to be the earliest example of man-made flight. Some kites in China and Japan were capable of carrying a man into the air. The ancient Chinese also flew small hot air lanterns and bamboo copter toys with spinning rotors. Leonardo da Vinci's 15th century dream of flight found expression in several rational but unscientific designs, though he did not attempt to construct any of them. The discovery of hydrogen gas in the 18th century led to the invention of the hydrogen balloon. At almost exactly the same time that the Montgolfier brothers discovered the hot air balloon and began manned flights. Various theories in mechanics by physicists during the same time period, notably fluid dynamics and Newton's law of motion, led to the foundation of modern aerodynamics, most notably by Sir George Cayley. Balloons, both free-flying and tethered, began to be used for military purposes from the end of the 18th century, with the French government establishing balloon companies during the Revolution. The term aviation, noun of action, from stem of Latin avis, bird, was coined in 1863 by French pioneer Guillaume Joseph Gabriel de la Landelle, 1812 to 1886. In aviation, all navigation aérienne. Experiments with gliders provided the groundwork for heavier-than-air craft, and by the early 20th century, advances in engine technology and aerodynamics made controlled powered flights possible for the first time. The modern airplane, with its characteristic tail, was established by 1909, and from then on, the history of the aeroplane became tied to the development of more and more powerful engines. The first great ships of the air were the rigid dirigible balloons pioneered by Zeppelin, which soon became synonymous with airships and dominated long-distance flights until the 1930s, when large flying boats became popular. After World War II, the flying boats were in their turn replaced by land planes, and the new and immensely powerful jet engine revolutionized both air travel and military aviation. In the latter part of the 20th century, the advent of digital electronics produced great advances in flight instrumentation and fly-by-wire systems. The 21st century saw the large-scale use of pilotless drones for military, civilian, and leisure use. Primitive beginnings. Tower jumping. Daedalus working on Icarus wings. The origin of mankind's desire to fly is lost in the distant past. From the earliest legends, there have been stories of men strapping bird-like wings, stiffened cloaks, or other devices to themselves and attempting to fly, typically by jumping off a tower. The Greek legend of Daedalus and Icarus is one of the earliest known. Others originated from India, China, and the European Dark Ages. During this early period, the issues of lift, stability, and control were not understood, and most attempts ended in serious injury or death. In medieval Europe, the earliest recorded tower jump dates from 852 AD, when Armand Furman made a jump in Cordoba, Spain, reportedly covering his body with vulture feathers and attaching 2 wings to his arms. Elmer of Malmesbury soon followed, and many others have continued to do so over the centuries. As late as 1811, Albrecht Berblinger constructed an ornithopter and jumped into the Danube at Ulm. Kites. The kite may have been the first form of man-made aircraft. It was invented in China possibly as far back as the 5th century BC by Mozi or Modi and Luban or Konshuban. Later designs often emulated flying insects, birds, and other beasts, both real and mythical. Some were fitted with strings and whistles to make musical sounds while flying. Ancient and medieval Chinese sources describe kites being used to measure distances, test the wind, lift man, signal, and communicate and send messages. Kites spread from China around the world. After its introduction into India, the kite further evolved into the fighter kite, where an abrasive line is used to cut down other kites. Man-carrying kites are believed to have been used extensively in ancient China for both civil and military purposes, and sometimes enforced as a punishment. An early recorded flight was that of the prisoner Yuan Hangtou, a Chinese prince, in the 6th century AD. Stories of man-carrying kites also occur in Japan, following the introduction of the kite from China around the 7th century AD. It is said that at one time there was a Japanese law against man-carrying kites. Rotor wings. The use of a rotor for vertical flight has existed since 400 BC in the form of the bamboo copter, an ancient Chinese toy. The similar Molinet Ayunux rotor on a nut appeared in Europe in the 14th century AD. Hot air balloons. A sky lantern. From ancient Chinese times, they have understood that hot air rises and have applied the principle to a type of small hot air balloon called a sky lantern. A sky lantern consists of a paper balloon under or just inside which a small lamp is placed. Sky lanterns are traditionally launched for pleasure and during festivals. According to Joseph Needham, such lanterns were known in China from the 3rd century BC. Their military use is attributed to General Zhuge Liang, 180 to 234 AD. The horrific title, Kong Ming, who is said to have used them to scare the enemy troops. There is evidence that the Chinese also solved the problem of aerial navigation using balloons hundreds of years before the 18th century. Renaissance. One of Leonardo's sketches. Eventually, some investigators began to discover and define some of the basics of rational aircraft design. Most notable of these was Leonardo da Vinci, although his work remained unknown until 1797, and so had no influence on developments over the next 300 years. While his designs were at least rational, they were not based on any particular good science. Leonardo studied bird flight, analyzing it and anticipating many principles of aerodynamics. He did at least understand that an object offers as much resistance to the air as the air does to the object. Newton would not publish the third law of motion until 1687. From the last years of the 15th century on, he wrote about and sketched many designs for flying machines and mechanisms, including ornithopters, fixed-wing gliders, rotorcraft, and parachutes. His early designs were man-powered types, including ornithopters and rotorcraft. However, he came to realize the impracticality of this and later turned to controlled gliding flights, also sketching some designs powered by a spring. Lighter than air. Beginnings of modern theory. In 1670, Francesco Lana de Terzi published a work that suggested lighter-than-air flight would be possible by using copper foil spheres that, containing a vacuum, would be lighter than the displaced air to lift an airship. While theoretically sound, his design was not feasible. The pressure of the surrounding air would crush the spheres. The idea of using vacuum to produce lift is now known as vacuum airship, but remains unfeasible with any current materials. In 1709, Bartolomeu de Gusmão presented a petition to King John V of Portugal, begging for his support for his invention of an airship, in which he expressed the greatest confidence. The public test of the machine, which was set for June 24, 1709, did not take place. According to the contemporary reports, however, Gusmão appears to have made several less ambitious experiments with this machine. Descending from eminences, it is certain that Gusmão was working on this principle at the public exhibition he gave before the court on August 8, 1709, in the hall of the Casa da India in Lisbon, when he propelled a ball to the roof by combustion. Balloons. In 1783, it was a watershed year for ballooning and aviation. Between June 4th and December 1st, 5 aviation firsts were achieved in France. On the 4th of June, the Montgolfier brothers demonstrated unmanned hot air balloon at Annonay, France. On 27th August, Jack Charles and Robert Brothers, Les Frères Robert, launched the world's first unmanned hydrogen-filled balloon from the Champ de Mars, Paris. On 19th October, the Montgolfier brothers launched the first manned flight, a tethered balloon with humans on board, at the Folie Titan in Paris. The aviators were the scientist Jean-Francois Pilatre de Rosière, the manufacturer manager Jean-Baptiste Réveillon, and Gerard de Villiers. On 21st November, the Montgolfier brothers launched the first free flight with humans as passengers. King Louis XIV had originally decreed that condemned criminals would be the first pilots, but Jean de Francois Pilatre de Rosière, along with Marquis Francois de Hollandaise, successfully petitioned for the honor. They drifted 8 kilometers, or 5 miles, in a balloon powered by a wood fire. On the 1st of December, Jacques Charles and Nicolas Louis Robert launched their manned hydrogen balloon from the Jardin des Tuileries in Paris amid a crowd of 400,000. They ascended to a height of about 1,800 feet, or 550 meters, and landed at sunset, Nesles-la-Vallée, after a flight of 2 hours and 5 minutes, covering 36 kilometers. After Robert aligned, Charles decided to ascend alone. This time, he ascended rapidly to an altitude of about 9,800 feet, 3,000 meters, where he saw the sun again, suffered extreme pain in his ears, and never flew again. Ballooning became a major rage in Europe in the late 18th century, providing the first detailed understanding of the relationship between altitude and the atmosphere. Work on developing a steerable or dirigible balloon, now called an airship, continued sporadically throughout the 19th century. The first powered, controlled, sustained lighter-than-air flight is believed to have taken place in 1852, when Henry Giffard flew 15 miles, or 24 kilometers, in France with a steam engine driven craft. Non-steerable balloons were employed during the American Civil War by the Union Army Balloon Corps. The young Ferdinand von Zeppelin first flew as balloon passenger with the Union Army at the Potomac in 1863. In the early 1900s, ballooning was a popular sport in Britain. These privately owned balloons usually used coal gas as the lifting gas. This has half the lifting power of hydrogen, so the balloons had to be larger. However, coal was far more readily available, and the local gas works sometimes provided by a special lightweight formula for ballooning events. Airships. Santos Dumont No. 6 rounding the Eiffel Tower in the process of winning the Douche de la Morte Prize, October 1901. Airships were originally called dirigible balloons and are still sometimes called dirigibles today. Another advance was made in 1884 when the first fully controllable free flight was made in a French Army electric-powered airship, La France, by Charles Renard and Arthur Krebs. The 170-foot or 52-meter long, 66,000 cubic foot, 1,900 cube meters airship covered 8 kilometers, 5 miles in 23 minutes, with the aid of an 8.5 horsepower electric motor. Airships. However, these aircraft were generally short-lived and extremely frail. Routine controlled flights would not occur until the advent of the internal combustion engine. The first aircraft to make routine controlled flights were non-rigid airships, sometimes called blimps. The most successful early pioneering pilot of this type of aircraft was the Brazilian Alberto Santos Dumont, who effectively combined a balloon with an internal combustion engine. On 19th October 1901, he flew his airship No. 6 over Paris from the Parc des Saint Cloud around the Eiffel Tower and back in under 30 minutes to win the Douche de la Morte Prize. Santos Dumont went on to design and build several aircraft. Subsequent controversies surrounding his and others' competing claims with regard to aircraft overshadowed his great contribution to the development of airship. At the same time that non-rigid airships were starting to have some success, the first successful rigid airships were also being developed. These would be far more capable than fixed-wing aircraft in terms of pure cargo carrying capacity for decades. Rigid airship design and advancement was pioneered by the German Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin. Construction of the first Zeppelin airship began in 1899 in a floating assembly hall on Lake Constance in the Bay of Moselle, Friedrichshafen. This was intended to ease the starting procedure, as the hull could easily be aligned with the wind. The prototype airship LZ-1, LZ for Luftschiffe Zeppelin, had a length of 128 meters or 420 feet, was driven by two 10.6 kilowatt or 14.2 horsepower Daimler engines and balanced by moving a weight between its two nacelles. Airships. Its first flight on July 2nd, 1900 lasted for only 18 minutes as LZ-1 was forced to land on the lake after the winding mechanism for the balancing weight had broken. Upon repair, the technology proved its potential in subsequent flights, bettering 6 meter per second speed attained by the French airship La France by 3 meters per second, but could not yet convince possible investors. It would be several years before the Count was able to raise enough funds for another try. Although airships were used both in World War I and II and continue on a limited basis to this day, their development was largely overshadowed by heavier than air craft. Heavier than air. The 17th and 18th centuries. Italian inventor Tito Livio Buratini, invited by the Polish king Ladislaw IV to his court in Warsaw, built a model aircraft with 4 fixed glider wings in 1647. Described as 4 pairs of wings attached to an elaborate dragon, he was said to have successfully lifted a cat in 1648, but not Buratini himself. He promised that only the most minor injuries would result from landing the craft. His Dragon Volant is considered the most elaborate and sophisticated aeroplane to be built before the 19th century. Sketch of a machine for flying in the air. The first published paper on aviation was Sketch of a Machine for Flying in the Air by Emanuel Swedenborg, published in 1716. This flying machine consisted of a light frame covered with strong canvas and provided with 2 large oars or wings moving on a horizontal axis, arranged so that the upstroke met with no resistance while the downstroke provided lifting power. Swedenborg knew that the machine would not fly, but suggested it as a start and was confident that the problem would be solved. He wrote, "It seems easier to talk of such a machine than to put it into actuality, but it requires greater force and less weight than exists in a human body. The science of mechanics might perhaps suggest a means, namely a strong spiral spring. If these advantages and requisites are observed, perhaps in time to come, someone might know how better to utilize our sketch and cause some addition to be made, so as to accomplish that which we can only suggest. Yet there are sufficient proofs and examples from nature that such flights can take place without danger, although when the first trials are made, you may have to pay for the experience and not mind an arm or a leg." Swedenborg would prove prescient in his observation that a method of powering an aircraft was one of the critical problems to overcome. The 19th century. Throughout the 19th century, tower jumping was replaced by the equally fatal but equally popular balloon jumping as a way to demonstrate the continued uselessness of manpower and flapping wings. Meanwhile, the scientific study of heavier than air flight began in earnest. Sir George Cayley and the first modern aircraft. Sir George Cayley was the first father of the aeroplane in 1846. During the last years of the previous century, he had begun the first rigorous study of the physics of flight and would later design the first modern heavier than air craft. Among his many achievements, his most important contributions to aeronautics include clarifying our ideas and laying down the principles of heavier than air flight, reaching a scientific understanding of the principles of bird flight, conducting scientific aerodynamic experiments demonstrating drag and streamlining movement of the center of pressure and the increase in lift from curving the wing surface, defining the modern airplane configuration comprising a fixed wing, fuselage and tail assembly, demonstration of manned gliding flight, Setting out the principles of power-to-weight ratio in sustaining flight, Cayley's first innovation was to study the basics science of lift and adopting the whirling arm test rig for use in aircraft research and using simple aerodynamic models on the arm rather than attempting to fly a model of a complete design. In 1799, he set down the concept of the modern airplane as a fixed wing flying machine with separate systems for lift, propulsion, and control. In 1804, Cayley constructed a model glider, which was the first modern heavier-than-air flying machine, having the layout of a conventional modern aircraft, with an inclined wing towards the front and adjustable tail at the back with both tailplane and fin. A movable weight allowed adjustment of the model's center of gravity. The governable parachute design of 1852. In 1809, goaded by the farcical antics of his contemporaries, he began a publication of a landmark three-part treatise titled On Aerial Navigation, 1809 to 1810. In it, he wrote the first scientific statement of the problem. The whole problem is confined within these limits, viz., to make a surface support a given weight by the application of power to the resistance of air. He identified the four vectors forces that influenced an aircraft: thrust, lift, drag, and weight, and distinguished stability and control in his designs. He also identified and described the importance of the cambered aerofoil, dihedral, diagonal bracing, and drag reduction, and contributed to the understanding and design of ornithopters and parachutes. In 1848, he had progressed far enough to construct a glider in the form of a triplane large and safe enough to carry a child. A local boy was chosen, but his name is not known. He went on to publish in 1852 the design for a full-size manned glider or governable parachute to be launched from a balloon, and then to construct a version capable of launching from the top of a hill, which carried the first adult aviator across Brompton Dale in 1853. Minor inventions included the rubber-powered motor, which provided a reliable power source for research models. By 1808, he had even reinvented the wheel, devising the tension-spoked wheel, in which all compression loads are carried by the rim, allowing a lightweight undercarriage. The age of steam. Drawing directly from Cayley's work, Henson's 1842 design for an aerial steam carriage broke new ground. Although only a design, it was the first in history for a propeller-driven fixed-wing aircraft. In 1866, the founding of the Aeronautical Society of Great Britain, and 2 years later, the world's first aeronautical exhibition was held at the Crystal Palace, London, where John Stringfellow was awarded £100 prize for the steam engine with the best power-to-weight ratio. Francis Herbert Wenham presented the first paper to the newly formed Aeronautical Society, later the Royal Aeronautical Society, on aerial locomotion. He advanced Cayley's work on cambered wings, making important findings. To test his ideas, from 1858, he had constructed several gliders from manned and unmanned, and with up to 5 stacked wings. He realized that long, thin wings are better than bat-like ones, because they have more leading edge for the area. Today, this relationship is known as the aspect ratio of a wing. The latter part of the 19th century became a period of intense study, characterized by the gentlemen scientists who represented most research efforts until the 20th century.
Among them was the British scientist, philosopher, and inventor Matthew Piers Watt Boulton, who studied lateral flight control and was the first to patent an aileron control system in 1868. In 1871, Wenham and Browning made the first wind tunnel. Felix du Temple's 1874 monoplane, shown in the picture in the center. Meanwhile, the British advances had galvanized French researchers. In 1857, Felix du Temple proposed a monoplane with a tail plane and retractable and undercarriage, developing his ideas with a model powered first by clockwork and later by steam. He eventually achieved a short hop with a full-sized manned aircraft in 1874. It achieved liftoff under its own power after launching from a ramp, glided for a short time, and returned safely. In 1856, Frenchman Jean-Marie Lebris made the first flight higher than 1865 of departure Pierre by having his glider, influential book L'Albatros Artificiel, pulled by a horse on a beach. He reportedly achieved a height of 100 meters over a distance of 200 meters. Plano 4 model airplane by Alphonse Pinard, 1871, shown in the picture on the left side. Alphonse Pinard, a Frenchman living from 1850 to 1880, advanced the theory of wing contours in aerodynamics and constructed successful models of aeroplanes, helicopters, and ornithopters. In 1871, he flew the first aerodynamically stable fixed-wing aeroplane, a model monoplane he called the Plano 4, a distance of 40 meters, 130 feet. Pinard's model incorporated several of Cayley's discoveries, including the use of a tail wing dihedral for inherent stability and rubber power. The Plano 4 also had longitudinal stability, being trimmed such that the tailplane was set at a smaller angle of incidence than the wings, an original and important contribution to the theory of aerodynamics, or aeronautics. Pinard's later project for an amphibian aeroplane, although never built, incorporated other modern features: a tailless monoplane with a single vertical fin and twin tractor propellers. It also featured hinged rear elevator and rudder surfaces, retractable undercarriage, and a fully enclosed instrumented cockpit. Equally authoritative as a theorist was Pinard's fellow countryman, Victor Totin. In 1879, he flew a model which, like Pinard's project, was a monoplane with twin tractor propellers, but also had a separate horizontal tail. It was powered by compressed air, flown tethered to a pole. This was the first model to take off under its own power. In 1884, Alexander Goupil published his work, La locomotion aérienne, aerial locomotion, although the flying machine he later constructed failed to fly. Clement Audeur, Avion 3. In 1897, a photograph shown on the right side of the screen. In 1890, the French engineer Clement Audeur completed the first of 3 steam-driven flying machines, the AO. On October 9, 1890, Audeur made an uncontrolled hop of around 50 meters, or 165 feet. This was the first manned airplane to take off under its own power. His Avion 3 in 1897, notable only for having twin steam engines, failed to fly. Audeur would later claim his success and was not debunked until 1910, when the French Army published its report on his attempt. Sir Hiram Maxim was an American engineer who had moved to England. He built his own whirling arm rig and wind tunnel, and constructed a large machine with a wingspan of about 105 feet, 32 meters, a length of 145 feet, 44 meters. fore and aft, horizontal surfaces, and a crew of 3. Twin propellers were powered by 2 lightweight compound steam engines, each delivering 180 horsepower or 130 kilowatt. Overall weight was 8,000 pounds, 3,600 kilograms. It was intended as a test rig to investigate aerodynamic lift. Lacking flight controls, it ran on rails with a second set of rails above the wheels to restrain it. Completed in 1894, on its third run, it broke from the rail, became airborne for several hundred feet at 2 to 3 feet altitude, and was badly damaged upon falling back to the ground. It was subsequently repaired, but Maxim abandoned his experiments shortly afterwards. Learning to glide. The Biot Massa glider, restored and on display at the Musée de l'Air in the last decade or so of the 19th century, a number of key figures were refining and defining the modern airplane. Lacking a suitable engine, aircraft work focused on stability and control of gliding flight. In 1879, Biot constructed a bird-like glider with the help of Massia and flew it briefly. It is preserved in the Musée de l'Air, France, and is claimed to be the earliest man-carrying flying machine still in existence. The Englishman Horatio Phillips made key contributions to aerodynamics. He conducted extensive wind tunnel research on aerofoil sections, providing the principles of aerodynamic lift foreseen by Cayley and Wenham. His findings underpin all modern aerofoil design. Otto Lilienthal, shown in the picture on the right side of the screen, May 29, 1895, became known as the Glider King or Flying Man of Germany. He duplicated Wenham's work and greatly expanded on it in 1884, publishing his research in 1889 as Bird Flight as the Basis of Aviation. He also produced a series of hang gliders, including bat-wing, monoplane, and biplane forms, such as the Derwitzer glider and normal soaring apparatus. Starting in 1891, he became the first person to make controlled untethered glides routinely, and the first to be photographed flying a heavier than air machine. Stimulating interest around the world, he rigorously documented his work, including photographs, and for this reason is one of the best known of the early pioneers. Lilienthal made over 2,000 glides until his death in 1896 from injuries sustained in a glider crash. Picking up where Lilienthal left off, Octave Chanute took up aircraft design as an early retirement. He funded the development of several gliders. In the summer of 1896, his team flew several of their designs, eventually deciding that the best was a biplane design. Like Lilienthal, he documented and photographed his work. In Britain, Percy Pilcher, who had worked for Maxim, built and successfully flew several gliders during the mid to late 1890s. The invention of the box kites during this period by the Australian Lawrence Hargrave would lead to the development of the practical biplane. In 1894, Hargrave linked 4 of his kites together, added a sling seat, and flew 16 feet or 4.9 meters. Later pioneers of manned kite flying included Samuel Franklin Cody in England and Captain Jean Sacconi in France. Langley, shown on the screen, the first failure of Langley's manned aerodrome. on the Potomac River, October 7, 1903. After a distinguished career in astronomy and shortly before becoming secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Samuel Pierpont Langley started a serious investigation into aerodynamics at what is today the University of Pittsburgh. In 1891, he published Experiments in Aerodynamics detailing his research, and then turned to building his designs. He hoped to achieve automatic aerodynamic stability, so he gave little consideration to in-flight control. On May 6, 1896, Langley's Aerodrome No. 5 made the first successful sustained flight of an unpiloted, engine-driven, heavier-than-air craft of substantial size. It was launched from a spring-actuated catapult mounted on top of a houseboat on the Potomac River near Quantico, Virginia. 2 flights were made that afternoon, one of 1,005 meters, 3,297 feet, and a second of 700 meters, 2,300 feet, at a speed of approximately 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour. On both occasions, the Aerodrome No. 5 landed in the water as planned, because in order to save the weights, it was not equipped with landing gear. On November 28, 1896, another successful flight was made with the Aerodrome No. 6. This flight, 1,460 meters, was witnessed and photographed by Alexander Graham Bell. The Aerodrome No. 6 was actually Aerodrome No. 4 greatly modified, so little remained of the original aircraft that it was given a new designation. With the successes of the Aerodrome No. 5 and No. 6, Langley started looking for funding to build a full-scale man-carrying version of his design, spurred by the Spanish-American War. The U.S. government granted him $50,000 to develop a man-carrying flying machine for aerial reconnaissance. Langley planned on building a scaled-up version known as the Aerodrome A, and started with the smaller quarter-scale Aerodrome, which flew twice on June 19, 1901, and then again with a newer and more powerful engine in 1903. Manley. With the basic design apparently successfully tested, he then turned to the problem of a suitable engine. He contracted Stephen Balzer to build one, but was disappointed when it delivered only 8 horsepower, 6.0 kilowatts, instead of the 12 horsepower, 8.9 kilowatt he expected. Langley's assistant, Charles M. Manley, then reworked the design into a 5-cylinder water-cooled radial that delivered 52 horsepower, 39 kilowatts at 950 RPM, a feat that took years to duplicate. Now, with both power and design, Langley put the two together with great hopes. To his dismay, the resulting aircraft proved to be too fragile. Simply scaling up the original small models resulted in a design that was too weak to hold itself together. 2 launches in the late 1903 both ended with the aerodrome immediately crashing into the water. The pilot, Manley, was rescued each time. Also, the aircraft's control system was inadequate to allow quick pilot responses, and it had no method of lateral control, and the aerodrome's aerial stability was marginal. Langley's attempts to gain further funding failed, and his efforts ended. 9 days after his second abortive launch on December 8th, the Wright brothers successfully flew their flyer. Glenn Curtiss made 93 modifications to the aerodrome and flew this very different aircraft in 1914. Without acknowledging the modifications, the Smithsonian Institution asserted that Langley's aerodrome was the first machine capable of flight. Whitehead. As shown on the screen, top left, The number 1 monoplane seen from the rear, Whitehead sits beside it with daughter Rose in his lap. Others in the photo are not identified. Gustav Weibkopf was a German who emigrated to the United States, where he soon changed his name to Gustav Whitehead. From 1897 to 1915, he designed and built early flying machines and engines. On August 14, 1901, 2.5 years before the Wright Brothers' flight, he claimed to have carried out a controlled, powered flight in his number 21 monoplane at Fairfield, Connecticut. The flight was reported in the Bridgeport Sunday Herald local newspaper. About 30 years later, several people, questioned by a researcher, claimed to have seen that or other Whitehead flights. In March 2013, the Jane's All of the World's Aircraft, an authoritative source for contemporary aviation, published an editorial which accepted Whitehead's flight as the first manned, powered, controlled flight of a heavier-than aircraft. The Smithsonian Institution, custodians of the original Wright flyer from the Wright Brothers, and many aviation historians continue to maintain that Whitehead did not fly as suggested. Shown on the lower right is an alleged photo of the actual flying machines, the flying machine in action. In other words, it is a alleged original photo of the actual machine flying Whitehead's number 21 monoplane. The Wright Brothers. Using a methodological approach and concentrating on the controllability of the aircraft, the brothers built and tested a series of kite and glider designs from 1900 to 1902 before attempting to build a powered design. The gliders worked, but not as the Wrights had expected based on the experiments and writings of their 19th century predecessors. The first glider, launched in 1900, was only about half the lift they anticipated. Their second glider, built the following year, performed even more poorly. Rather than giving up, the Wrights constructed their own wind tunnel and created a number of sophisticated devices to measure lift and drag on the 200 wing designs they tested. As a result, the Wrights corrected earlier mistakes in calculations regarding drag and lift. Their testing and calculating produced a third glider with a higher aspect ratio and true 3-axis control. They flew it successfully hundreds of times in 1902, and it performed far better than the previous models by using a rigorous system of experimentation involving wind tunnel testing of airfoils and flight testing of full-size prototypes. The Wrights not only built a working aircraft, the Wright Flyer, but also helped advance the science of aeronautical engineering. The Wrights appeared to be the first to make serious studied attempts to simultaneously solve the power and control problems. Both problems proved difficult, but they never lost interest. They solved the control problem by inventing wing warping for roll control combined with simultaneous yaw control with a steerable rear rudder. Almost as an afterthought, they designed and built a low-powered internal combustion engine. They also designed and carved wooden propellers that were more efficient than any before, enabling them to gain adequate performance from their low engine power. Although wing warping as a means of lateral control was used only briefly during the early history of aviation, the principle of combining lateral control in combination with a rudder was a key advance in aircraft control. While many aviation pioneers appeared to leave safety largely to chance, the Wrights' design was greatly influenced by the need to teach themselves to fly without unreasonable risk to life or limb by surviving crashes. This emphasis, as well as low engine power, was the reason for low flying speed and for taking off in a headwind. Performance, rather than safety, was the reason for the rear-heavy design, because the canard could not be highly loaded. Anhedral wings were less affected by crosswinds and were consistent with the low yaw stability. According to the Smithsonian Institution and Fédération Aéronautique Internationale (FAI), the Wrights made the first sustained, controlled, powered, heavier-than-air manned flight at Kill Devil Hills, North Carolina, 4 miles, 8 kilometers south of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, on December 17, 1903. The first flight by Orville Wright of 120 feet, 37 meters, in 12 seconds was recorded in a famous photograph. In the fourth flight of the same day, Wilbur Wright flew 852 feet, 260 meters in 59 seconds. In 59 seconds. The flights were witnessed by 3 coastal life-saving crewmen, a local businessman, and a boy from the village, making these the first public flights and the first well-documented ones. Orville described the final flights of the day. The first few hundred feet were up and down as before, but by the time the 300 feet had been covered, the machine was under much better control. The course for the next 400 or 500 feet had but little undulation. However, when out about 800 feet, the machine began pitching again, and in one of its darts downward struck the ground. The distance over the ground was measured to be 852 feet, 260 meters. The time of the flight was 59 seconds. The frame supporting the front rudder was badly broken, but the main part of the machine was not injured at all. We estimated that the machine could be put in condition for flight again in about a day or two. They flew only about 10 feet above the ground as a safety precaution, so they had little room to maneuver, and all 4 flights in the gusty winds ended in a bumpy and unintended landing. Modern analysis by Professor Fred E.C. Kulik and Henry R. Rex, 1985, has demonstrated that the 1903 Wright Flyer was so unstable as to be almost unmanageable by anyone but the Wrights, who had trained themselves in the 1902 glider. The Wrights continued flying at Huffman Prairie near Dayton, Ohio, 1904 to 1905. In May 1904, they introduced the Flyer II, a heavier and improved version of the original Flyer. On June 23, 1905, they first flew a third machine, the Flyer III. After a severe crash on 14 July 1905, they rebuilt the Flyer III and made important design changes. They almost doubled the size of the elevator and rudder and moved them about twice the distance from the wings. They added 2 fixed vertical vanes, called blinkers, between the elevators and gave the wings a very slight dihedral. They connected the rudder from the wing warping control, and as in all future aircraft, placed it on a separate control handle. When flights resumed, the results were immediate. The serious pitch instability that hampered Flyers 1 and 2 was significantly reduced, so repeated minor crashes were eliminated. Flights with the redesigned Flyer 3 started lasting over 10 minutes, then 20, then 30. The Flyer 3 became the first practical aircraft, though without wheels and needing a launching device, flying consistently under full control and bringing its pilot back to the starting point safely and landing without damage. On 5th October 1905, Wilbur flew 24 miles, 39 kilometers in 39 minutes, 23 seconds. According to the April 1907 issue of the Scientific American magazine, the Wright brothers seemed to have the most advanced knowledge of heavier-than-air navigation at the time. However, the same magazine issue also claimed that no public flight had been made in the United States before its April 1907 issue. Hence, they devised a Scientific American aeronautic trophy in order to encourage the development of a heavier-than-air flying machine. The Pioneer Era, 1904-1914. This period saw the development of practical airplanes and airships and their early application alongside balloons and kites for private, sport, and military use. European pioneers. Although full details of the Wright brothers' system of flight control have been published in Il Aerophile in January 1906, the importance of this advantage was not recognized, and European experimenters generally concentrated on attempting to produce inherently stable machines. Short-powered flights were performed in France by Romanian engineer Traian Voia on March 18th and August 19th, 1906, when he flew 12 and 24 meters, respectively, in a self-designed, fully self-propelled fixed-wing aircraft that possessed a fully wheeled undercarriage. He was followed by Jacob Ellenhammer, who built a monoplane which he tested with a tether in Denmark on September 12, 1906, flying 42 meters. On September 13, 1906, a day after Ellenhammer's tethered flight and 3 years after the Wright brothers' flight, the Brazilian Alberto Santos Dumont made a public flight in Paris with the 14 bis, also known as the OCO de proie, French for bird of prey. This was a canard configuration with pronounced wing dihedral and covered a distance of 600 meters or 200 feet on the grounds of the Château de Bagatelle in Paris, Bois de Boulogne, before a large crowd of witnesses. This well-documented event was the first flight verified by the Aero Club of France of a powered, heavier-than-air machine in Europe, and won the Douche Archdeacon Prize for the first officially observed flight greater than 25 meters, 82 feet. On November 12, 1906, Santos Dumont set the world record recognized by the Federation of Aéronautique Internationale by flying 220 meters, 720 feet, in 21.5 seconds. Only one more brief flight was made by the 14 bis in March 1907, after which it was abandoned. In March 1907, Gabriel Voisin flew the first example of his Voisin biplane. On 13th January 1908, a second example of the type was flown by Henry Farman to win the Douche Archdeacon Grand Prix d'Aviation prize for a flight in which the aircraft flew a distance of more than a kilometer and landed at the point where it had taken off. The flight lasted 1 minute 28 seconds. Flight as an established technology. Alberto Santos Dumont flying the Moiselle over Paris. Santos Dumont later added ailerons between the wings in an effort to gain more lateral stability. His final design, first flown in 1907, was the series of the Moiselle monoplanes, numbers 19 through 22. The Moiselle number 19 could be constructed only in 15 days and became the world's first series production aircraft. The Demoiselle achieved 120 kilometers per hour. The fuselage consisted of three specially reinforced bamboo booms. The pilot sat a seat between the main wheels of a conventional landing gear, whose pair of wire-spoked main wheels were located at the lower front of the airframe, with a tail skid halfway back beneath the rear fuselage structure. The Demoiselle was controlled in flight by a cruciform tail unit hinged on a form of universal joint at the aft end of the fuselage structure to function as an elevator and rudder, with roll control provided through wing warping, number 20, with the wings only warping down. In 1908, Wilbur Wright traveled to Europe and, starting in August, gave a series of flight demonstrations at Le Mans in France. The first demonstration, made on 8th August, attracted an audience including most of the major French aviation experimenters, who were astonished by the clear superiority of the Wright Brothers aircraft, particularly its ability to make tight controlled turns. The importance of using roll control in making turns was recognized by almost all European experimenters. Henry Farman fitted ailerons to his Voisin biplane, and shortly afterwards set up his own aircraft construction business, whose first product was the influential Farman III biplane. The following year saw the widespread recognition of powered flight as something other than the preserve of dreamers and eccentrics. On 25th of July, Louis Blériot won worldwide fame by winning a £1,000 prize offered by the British Daily Mail newspaper for a flight across the English Channel. And in August, around 500,000 people, including the President of France, Armand Vallières, and David Lloyd George, attended one of the first aviation meetings, the Grand Semaine d'Aviation at Reims. Rotorcraft. In 1877, Enrico Forlanini developed an unmanned helicopter powered by a steam engine. It rose a height of 13 meters, where it remained for some 20 seconds, after a vertical takeoff from a park in Milan. Paul Cornune's helicopter, built in 1907, was the first manned flying machine to have risen from the ground using rotating wings instead of fixed wings. The first time a manned helicopter is known to have risen off the ground was on a tethered flight in 1907 by the Breguet Richer gyroplane. Later the same year, the Cornu helicopter, also French, made the first rotor-winged free flight at Lucenox, France. However, these were not practical designs. Military use. Almost as soon as they were invented, airplanes were used for military purposes. The first country to use them for military purposes was Italy, whose aircraft made reconnaissance, bombing, and artillery correction flights in Libya during the Italian-Turkish War, September 1911 to October 1912. The first mission, a reconnaissance, occurred on 23rd October 1911. The first bombing mission was flown in 1 November 1911. Then Bulgaria followed this example. Its airplanes attacked and reconnoitered the Ottoman positions during the First Balkan War, 1912-1913. The The first war-to-sea major use of airplanes in offensive, defensive, and reconnaissance capabilities was World War I. The Allies and Central Powers both used airplanes and airships extensively. While the concept of using an airplane as an offensive weapon was generally discounted before World War I, the idea of using it for photography was one that was not lost on any of the major forces. All of the major forces in Europe had light aircraft, typically derived from pre-war sporting designs, attached to their reconnaissance departments. Radio telephones were also being explored on airplanes, notably the SR-68, as seen in the picture, as communication between pilots and ground commander crew grew more and more important. The World War I, 1914-1918. Combat schemes. It was not long before aircraft were shooting at each other, but the lack of any sort of steady point for the gun was a problem. The French solved this problem when, in late 1914, Roland Garros attached a fixed machine gun to the front of his plane. But while Adolphe Pigot would become known as the first ace, getting credit for 5 victories before also becoming the first ace to die in action, it was German Luftwaffe Lieutenant Kurt Wintgens, who in July 1st, 1915, scored the very first aerial victory by a purpose-built fighter plane with a synchronized machine gun. Aviators were styled as modern-day knights, doing individual combat with their enemies. Several pilots became famous for their air-to-air combat. The most well-known is Manfred von Richthofen, better known as the Red Baron, who shot down 80 planes in air-to-air combat with several different planes, the most celebrated of which was the Fokker DR-1 on the Allied side. René Paul Funk is credited with the most all-time victories at 75, even when later wars were considered. France, Britain, Germany, Italy were the leading manufacturers of fighter planes that saw action during the war, with German aviation technologist Hugo Junkers showing the way to the future of much of the 20th century aviation through the pioneering of practical all-metal aircraft in the late 1915s. Between the World Wars, 1918-1939. The years between World War I and World War II saw great advances in aircraft technology. Airplanes evolved from low-powered biplanes made from wood and fabric to sleek, high-powered monoplanes made of aluminum, based primarily on the founding work of Hugo Junkers. During the World War I period, and its adoption by American designer William Bushell Stouts and Soviet designer Andrei Tupolev. The age of the great rigid airships came and went. The first successful rotorcraft appeared in the form of the Oro-Gyro, invented by Spanish engineer Juan de la Cierva and first flown in 1919. In this design, the rotor is not powered but is spun like a windmill by its passage through the air. A separate power plant is used to propel the aircraft forward. After World War I, experienced fighters were eager to show off their new skills. Many American pilots became barnstormers, flying into small towns across the country and showing off their flying abilities, as well as taking paying passengers for rides. Eventually, the barnstormers grouped into more organized displays. Air shows sprang up around the country, with air races, acrobatic stunts, and feats of air superiority. The air races drove engine and airframe development. The Schneider Trophy, for example, led to a series of even faster, ever faster and sleeker monoplane designs, culminating in the Supermarine S-6B with pilots competing for cash prizes. There was an incentive to go faster. Amelia Earhart was perhaps the most famous of those of the barnstorming airshow circuit. She was also the first female pilot to achieve records such as crossing of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Other prizes for distance and speed records also drove developments forward. For example, on June 14, 1919, Captain John Alcock and Lieutenant Arthur Brown piloted a Vickers Vimy non-stop from St. John's, Newfoundland to Clifton, Ireland, winning the 13,000 pounds or $65,000 Northcliffe Prize, the first flight across the South Atlantic, and the first aerial crossing using astronomical navigation was made by the naval aviators Cago Coutinho and Sacadura Cabral in 1922. The Lisbon, Portugal, and Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. From Lisbon, Portugal, and to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, with only internal means of navigation, in an aircraft specifically fitted for himself, with an artificial horizon for aeronautical use, an invention that revolutionized air navigation at the time. Cago Coutinho invented a type of sextant incorporating two spirit levels to provide an artificial horizon. 5 years later, Charles Lindbergh took the Ortec Prize, $25,000, for the first solo non-stop crossing of the Atlantic. Months after, Lindbergh, Paul Redfern was the first to solo the Caribbean Sea and was last seen flying over Venezuela. Australian Sir Charles Kingsford Smith was the first to fly across the larger Pacific Ocean in the Southern Cross. His crew left Oakland, California, to make the first trans-Pacific flight to Australia in 3 stages. The first, from Oakland to Hawaii, was 2,400 miles, took 27 hours and 25 minutes, and was uneventful. They then flew to Suva, Fiji, 3,100 miles away, taking 34 hours 30 minutes. This was the toughest part of the journey, as they flew through a massive lightning storm near the equator. They then flew on to Brisbane in 20 hours, where they landed on 9th June 1928 after approximately 7,400 miles total flight. On arrival, Kingsford Smith was met by a huge crowd of 25,000 at Eagle Farm Airport in his hometown of Brisbane. Accompanying him were Australian aviator Charles Ulm as the relief pilot, and the Americans James Warner and Captain Harry Lyon, who were the radio operator, navigator, and engineer. A week after they landed, Kingsford Smith and Ulm recorded a disc for Columbia, talking about their trip. With Ulm, Kingsford Smith later continued his journey, being the first in 1929 to circumnavigate the world, crossing the equator twice. The first lighter-than-air crossings of the Atlantic were made by airship. In July 1919 by His Majesty's Airship R-34 and crew when they flew from East Lithuanian, Scotland to Long Island, New York, and then back to Fulham, England. By 1929, airship technology had advanced to the point that the first round-the-world flight was completed by the Graf Zeppelin in September and in October. In the same aircraft inaugurated the first commercial transatlantic service. However, the age of the rigid airship ended following the destruction by fire of the Zeppelin LZ-129 Hindenburg just before landing at Lakehurst, New Jersey on May 6, 1937, killing 35 of the 97 people aboard. Previous spectacular airship accidents, from the Wingfoot Express disaster in 1919 to the loss of the R-101 in 1930, the Akron 1933, and the Macon 1935 had already cast doubt on airship safety. But with the disasters of the U.S. Navy's rigids showing the importance of solely using helium as the lifting medium, following the destruction of the Hindenburg, the remaining airship making international flights, the Graf Zeppelin, was retired in June 1937. Its replacement, the rigid airship Graf Zeppelin II, made a number of flights, primarily over Germany, from 1938 to 1939, but was grounded when Germany began World War II. Both remaining German Zeppelins were scrapped in 1940 to supply metal for the German Luftwaffe. The last American rigid airship, the Los Angeles, which was not flown since 1932, was dismantled in late 1939. Meanwhile, in Germany, which was restricted by the Treaty of Versailles in its development of powered aircraft, instead developed gliding as a sport, especially at the Wasser Cup during the 1920s. In its various forms, in the 21st century, sailplane aviation was now over 400,000 participants. Had over 400,000 participants. In 1929, Jimmy Doolittle developed instrument flight. 1929 also saw the first flight of, by far, the largest plane ever built until then, the Dornier DoX, with a wingspan of 48 meters. On its 70th flight on October 21st, there were 169 people on board, a record that was not broken for 20 years. Less than a decade after the development of the first practical rotorcraft of any type with the autogyro in the Soviet Union, Boris N. Yurev and Alexei M. Sheremokin, two aeronautical engineers working at the Centralny Aerodromyanchensky Institute, or the Central Aerodynamic Institute, constructed and flew the TS-AGI-1EA single-rotor helicopter, which used an open tubing framework and a 4-blade main rotor and twin sets of 1.8 meter 5.9 diameter anti-torque rotors. One set of 2 at the nose and one set of 2 at the tail, powered by 2 M2 power plants. Uprated copies of the Genome monosopop rotary radio engine of World War I, the TS-AGI-1EA made several successful low altitude flights. By 14 August 1932, Sheremokin managed to get the 1EA up to an unofficial altitude of 605 meters, close to 1,985 feet, with what is likely to be the first successful single-lift rotor helicopter design ever tested and flown. Only 5 years after the German Dornier Dox had flown, Tupolev designed the largest aircraft of the 1930s era, the Maxim Gorky, in the Soviet Union by 1934 as the largest aircraft ever built using the Junkers methods of metal aircraft construction. In the 1930s, development of the jet engine began in Germany and Britain. Both countries would go on to develop jet aircraft by the end of World War II. World War II, 1939-1945. World War II saw a great increase in the pace of development and production, not only of aircraft but also of the associated flight-based weapon delivery systems. Air combat tactics and doctrines took advantage. Large-scale strategic bombing campaigns were launched, fighter escorts introduced, and the more flexible aircraft and weapons allowed precise attacks on small targets with dive bombers, fighter bombers, and ground attack aircraft. New technologies like radar also allowed more coordinated, controlled deployment of air defense. The Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, seen on the picture left side. The first jet aircraft to fly was the Heinkel HE-178 from Germany, flown by Erich Warsitz in 1939, followed by the world's first operational jet aircraft, the Me-262 in July 1942, and the world's first jet-powered bomber, the Arado AR-234, in June 1943. British developments like the Gloucester Meteor followed afterwards, but saw only brief use in World War II. The first cruise missile, the V-1, first ballistic missile, the V-2, and the first, and to date the only, operational rocket-powered combat aircraft, the Me-163, with attained velocities of up to 1,130 km per hour or 700 miles per hour in test flights, and the first vertical takeoff manned point defense interceptor, the Bakum BA-349 Nader, that were also developed by Germany. However, jet and rocket aircraft had only limited impact due to their late introduction, fuel shortages, the lack of experienced pilots, and the declining war industry of Germany. Not only airplanes but also helicopters saw rapid development in the Second World War, with the introduction of the Fokker Agilis FA-223, the Flettner Fi-282 Syncropter in 1941 in Germany, and the Sikorsky R-4 in 1942 in the USA. The post-war era, 1945 to 1979. After World War II, commercial aviation grew rapidly, using mostly ex-military aircraft to transport people and cargo. This growth was accelerated by the glut of heavy and super heavy bomber airframes like the B-29 and Lancaster that could be converted into commercial aircraft. The DC-3 also made for easier and longer commercial flights. The first commercial jet airliner to fly was the British de Havilland Comet. By 1952, the British state airline BOAC had introduced the Comet into scheduled service. While a technical achievement, the plane suffered a series of highly public failures, as the shape of the windows led to cracks due to metal fatigue. The fatigue was caused by cycles of pressurization and depressurization of the cabin, and eventually led to catastrophic failure of the plane's fuselage. By the time of the problems were overcome, the jet airliner designs had already taken to the skies. The USSR's Aeroflot became the first airline in the world to operate sustained regular jet services on September 15, 1956, with the Tupolev Tu-104, the Boeing 707, and the DC-8, which established new levels of comfort, safety, and passenger expectations, ushered in the age of mass commercial air travel, dubbed the Jet Age. In October 1947, Chuck Yeager took the rocket-powered Bell X-1 through the sound barrier. Although anecdotal evidence exists that some fighter pilots may have done so while dive-bombing ground targets during the war, this was the first controlled, level flight to exceed the speed of sound. Further barriers of distance fell in 1948 and in 1952 with the first jet crossing of the Atlantic and the first non-stop flight to Australia. In 1945, invention of the nuclear bombs briefly increased the strategic importance of the military aircraft in the Cold War between East and West. Even a moderate fleet of long-range bombers could deliver a deadly blow to the enemy, so great efforts were made to develop countermeasures. At first, the supersonic interceptor aircraft were produced in considerable numbers. By 1955, most development efforts shifted to guided surface-to-air missiles. However, the approach diametrically changed when a new type of nuclear-carrying platform appeared that could not be stopped with any feasible way: the intercontinental ballistic missile. The possibility of these was demonstrated in 1957 with the launch of Sputnik 1 by the Soviet Union. This action started the space race between the nations. In 1961, the sky was no longer the limit for manned flight, as Yuri Gagarin orbited once around the planet in 108 minutes, and then used the descent module of Vostok 1 to safely re-enter the atmosphere and reduce speed from Mach 25 using friction and converting the kinetic energy to the velocity into heat. The United States responded by launching Alan Shepard into space on a suborbital flight in a Mercury space capsule. With the launch of the Alouette in 1963, Canada became the third country to send a satellite in space. The space race between the United States and the Soviet Union would ultimately lead to the landing of man on the moon in 1969. In 1967, the X-15 set the airspeed record for an aircraft at 4,534 miles per hour. That's 7,297 kilometers per hour, or Mach 6.1. Aside from vehicles designed to fly in outer space, this record was renewed by the X-43 in the 21st century. The Harrier jump jet, as seen on the picture on the left, often referred to as just Harrier or jump jet, is a British designed military jet aircraft capable of vertical short takeoff and landing, or VSTOL, via thrust vectoring. It first flew in 1969, the same year that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the moon, and Boeing unveiled the Boeing 747 at the Aerospatiale BAC Concorde, and the Aerospatiale BAC Concorde supersonic passenger airliner had made its maiden flight. The Boeing 747 was the largest commercial passenger aircraft ever to fly, and still carries millions of passengers each year, though it has been superseded by the Airbus 380. It has been superseded by the Airbus 380, which is capable of carrying up to 853 passengers. In 1975, Aeroflot started regular service of the Tu-144, the first supersonic passenger plane. In 1976, British Airways and Air France began supersonic service across the Atlantic with the Concorde. A few years earlier, the SR-71 Blackbird has set the record for crossing the Atlantic in under 2 hours, and the Concorde followed its footsteps. In 1975, the Gossamer Albatross became the first human-powered aircraft to cross the English Channel. This achievement finally saw the realization of centuries of dreams of human flight. The Digital Age, 1980 to the present. In 1986, Dick Rutan and Gianna Yeager flew an aircraft, the Rutan Voyager, around the world, unrefueled and without landing. In 1999, Bertrand Piccard became the first person to circle the Earth in a balloon. Digital fly-by-wire systems allow an aircraft to be designed with relaxed static stability, initially used to increase the maneuverability of military aircraft such as the General Dynamics F-16 Fighting Falcon. This is now being used to reduce drag on commercial airliners. In the beginning of the 21st century, digital technology allowed subsonic military aviation to begin eliminating the pilot in favor of remotely operated or completely autonomous unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs. In April 2001, the unmanned aircraft, the Global Hawk, flew from Edwards Air Force Base in the US to Australia non-stop and unrefueled. This is the longest point-to-point flight ever undertaken by an unmanned aircraft, and it took 23 hours and 23 minutes. In October 2003, the first totally autonomous flight across the Atlantic by a computer-controlled model aircraft occurred. UAVs are now an established feature of modern warfare, carrying out pinpoint attacks under the control of a remote operator. The Digital Age, 1980 to the present. The U.S. Centennial Flight Commission was established in 1999 to encourage the broadest national and international participation in the celebration of the 100 years of powered flight. It publicized and encouraged a number of programs, projects, and events intended to educate people about the history of aviation. Major disruptions to air travel in the 21st century included the closing of the U.S. airspace due to the September 11th attacks, and the closing of most European airspace after the 2010 eruption of the volcano. In 2015, André Borschberg flew a record distance of 4,481 miles, 77,212 kilometers, from Nagoya, Japan to Honolulu, Hawaii, in a solar-powered plane called Solar Impulse 2. This is the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening and watching. These are the references.